a tremendous mistake was when NATO just wasn't there. They just weren't there. It's going to make a lot of money for the United States because we spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on NATO, hundreds protecting them. And we would have always been there for them, but now based on their actions, I guess we don't have to be, do we?
Imagine you are a doctor. A patient has been declared dead. The heart has stopped beating. Everyone has accepted the inevitable. But strangely, the life support machine keeps running. Naturally, you would ask one particular question. Why? In many ways, that is the story of NATO. Because the enemy it was created to fight died more than 30 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came down. If NATO existed only to counter the Soviet Union, why didn't NATO disappear too? In fact, something even more surprising happened. NATO didn't shrink. It became larger, stronger, more influential. Today, more than 75 years after its creation, it remains the world's most powerful military alliance. So perhaps the real question isn't how NATO was created. The real question is, why is NATO still here? And perhaps even more importantly, will NATO survive the challenges of 21st century? Hello everyone, I'm Aditya Vashisht and welcome back to Bharat and Beyond. If you're passionate about understanding geopolitics, not through sensational headlines but through history, strategy and evidence, then you are in the right place. Today's topic is particularly important for every UPSC aspirant because NATO is no longer just a Cold War institution. It is deeply connected to the Russia-Ukraine war, the aggressive rise of China, the European security architecture, the Indo-Pacific, and even India's strategic choices. So let's begin our journey. Let's travel back to 1945. Europe had just emerged from the Second World War. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Rotterdam lay in ruins. Nearly 60 million people lost their lives worldwide. Industries collapsed. Entire economies were shattered. For Europe, the war had ended, but peace had not truly arrived. Instead, a different kind of conflict was beginning. Not a war of tanks crossing the borders, but a war of ideas. On one side stood the United States, championing the liberal democracy, capitalism, and open markets. On the other hand stood the Soviet Union, promoting communism and seeking to establish friendly governments along its borders. After suffering devastating invasions during both world wars, Moscow believed that a buffer of allied states was essential for its own security. This particular ideological rivalry soon became what we now call as the Cold War. The renowned historian John Lewis Gaddis described this as a global competition for power, security and ideological influence, where direct conflict between the two superpowers was largely avoided. But competition spread across the politics, the economics, the military strategy and technology. Western European countries realized something very important. Individually, they were too weak. Collectively, they could deter the aggression. That idea gave birth to one of the most influential military alliances in the modern history. On 4th of April 1949, 12 countries signed the Washington Treaty, establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or commonly referred to as NATO. Its central principle was remarkably simple. An attack on one particular member would be considered an attack on all. This particular principle became Article 5 of the treaty, the foundation of NATO's collective defense. Think about the message this particular thing sent. Any country planning to attack a NATO member would have to confront not one nation, but the combined military strength of the entire alliance. This is what strategic thinkers call deterrence, preventing war not by fighting it, but by making the cost of aggression unbearably high. Interestingly, throughout the entire Cold War, Article 5 was never invoked against Soviet Union. It has been invoked only once in NATO's history, after the 11th September 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. That single fact tells us something remarkable. Even before we discuss NATO's future, we must understand that NATO has never remained a static organization. It has continuously adapted to the changing threats. The first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Hastings Ismay, summed up the alliance's original purpose in one famous sentence: to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. In one line, he captured the geopolitical realities of post-war Europe, contain the expansion of Soviet Union, ensure America's long-term commitment to European security, and reassure Europe that Germany would never again become a militaristic threat. For decades, that strategy worked. NATO became one of the principal pillars of post-World War II international order. But history has a habit of asking uncomfortable questions. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Germany is now one of NATO's strongest supporters. And even the United States, the country that helped create NATO, is questioning parts of the alliance. So, if the world that created NATO has fundamentally changed, why hasn't NATO disappeared? And that's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Let's find out. The year was 1991. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Cold War was officially over. Across the world, people celebrated what many believed was the beginning of a more peaceful era. For NATO, however, this created an unexpected question. If alliance had been created to contain Soviet Union and the Soviet Union no longer existed, then what was NATO's purpose? Many experts believed the alliance had reached the end of its journey. In fact, one of the world's most influential strategic thinkers, Professor John Mearsheimer, argued that military alliances exist to respond to specific threats. Once the threat disappears, the alliance should gradually become irrelevant. From a realist perspective, international politics is driven by the power, the security, and national interest. Institutions are useful, but only as long as they serve those interests. On paper, Mearsheimer's argument made perfect sense, but history had a surprise in the store. Instead of shrinking, NATO expanded. In 1999, three former communist countries, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, joined the alliance. 5 years later, in 2004, NATO welcomed another 7 members, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 3 countries that once had been a part of the Soviet Union itself. Then came Montenegro, North Macedonia, Finland in 2023, and Sweden in 2024. Think about that for a moment. The alliance that many expected to disappear after 1991 became larger than ever before. So, what explains this extraordinary survival? Another eminent scholar, Professor Robert Keohane, offered a different answer. According to Keohane, institutions often outlive the crises that create them. Why? Because they build the habits of cooperation. Countries begin sharing the intelligence. Their armed forces train together. Weapons become interoperable. Military planning becomes coordinated. Political leaders develop trust through regular consultation. In other words, NATO had become much more than an anti-Soviet alliance. It had evolved into the security architecture of Europe. Then came the third perspective. Political scientist Alexander Wendt famously argued, "Anarchy is what states make of it." His point was profound. Countries are not held together only by fear. They're also held together by shared identities, shared values, shared political ideals. By the end of the Cold War, many scholars viewed NATO not merely as a military alliance, but as a community of liberal democracies committed to democracy, rule of law, and collective security. So perhaps NATO survived for 3 reasons. First, because countries still wanted security. Second, because institutions create long-term cooperation. And third, because democracies often find it easier to trust one another. But just when it seemed that NATO had found a purpose, another controversy emerged: its expansion. Imagine you are sitting in Moscow. For decades, NATO was your principal military rival. The Cold War ends. You expect military tensions to reduce. Instead, year after year, NATO moves closer to your borders. Countries that were once within the Soviet sphere of influence become NATO members. From Russia's perspective, this looked less like a defensive alliance and more like strategic encirclement. Now imagine you are sitting in Warsaw, or Tallinn, or Helsinki. Your memory of history is completely different. You remember decades of Soviet domination. You fear that history could repeat itself. Wouldn't you seek the protection of Article 5, under which an attack on one member, that is a NATO member, is treated as an attack on all? The same event, 2 completely different interpretations. This is what international relations scholars call as the security dilemma. A situation where one country's attempt to increase its own security unintentionally makes the other country feel less secure. Russia argues that NATO's eastward expansion undermined its strategic security. NATO responds that every sovereign nation has a right to choose its own security arrangements and that no outside power can veto that decision. It is important to note that historians continue to debate whether Western leaders ever made a formal promise that NATO would not expand eastwards. While discussions took place during German reunification in 1990, no legally binding treaty prohibited future NATO expansion or enlargement. This distinction is crucial for understanding the debate objectively. This disagreement lies at the heart of one of the most significant geopolitical conflicts of our time. Many analysts worldwide see it as an important factor in understanding the deterioration of relation between Russia and the West, eventually culminating in the Russia-Ukraine war. Ironically, the war that Russia hoped would weaken NATO ended up doing the opposite. It revived NATO's sense of purpose. It accelerated the defense spending. It brought Finland and Sweden into the alliance. And it reminded Europe that history has a habit of returning when we least expect it. But if Russia has made NATO more united externally, another challenge is quietly emerging from within. For the first time in decades, the debate is no longer only about Russia's intention. It is also about whether NATO's own members are willing to share the costs, the responsibilities, and the future vision of the alliance. And that is where the next chapter of our story begins. At first glance, it seems NATO has never been stronger. The alliance has expanded. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has united Europe. Public support for NATO has increased. Countries are spending more on defense than they have done in decades. So, case closed. Has NATO won? Not really. Because sometimes the greatest challenge to an alliance doesn't come from its enemies. It comes from its own members. And nowhere has the debate been more visible than the United States. For years, the US President Donald Trump has been questioning one of NATO's fundamental assumptions. His argument is very simple. Why should American taxpayers continue paying for Europe's security if many European countries are not paying enough themselves? Trump argues that the United States carries a disproportionate share of NATO's defense burden. He has publicly expressed disappointment that many NATO allies are unwilling to support Washington's position against Iran, which he described as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. In his view, NATO has been benefiting from American military power without always supporting American strategic priorities. Whether one agrees with Trump or not, he has forced NATO to confront a difficult question. Should NATO remain primarily a European defense alliance, or should it increasingly support America's global strategic objectives? That debate continues even today. But NATO has a different answer. Secretary General Mark Rutte has repeatedly argued that Europe has never been merely a passive beneficiary of American protection. He has pointed out the European alliance have consistently supported NATO operations through military deployments, logistics, intelligence cooperation, and infrastructure. During operations in Afghanistan, for example, European countries provided critical bases, airfields, and logistical support that enabled US-led missions. So, his message is simple. Burden sharing cannot be measured only in dollars. It must also be measured in troops, in equipments, infrastructure, intelligence, and political commitment. Yet, one reality cannot be ignored. For years, many NATO countries failed to meet even the alliance's benchmark of spending 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. That benchmark, first agreed by the NATO defense ministers and reaffirmed at the 2014 Wales summit after Russia's annexation of Crimea, became a symbol of political commitment to collective defense. However, the world changed dramatically after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Europe suddenly realized that conventional warfare had returned to the continent. The result? One of the biggest shifts in NATO's history. At the 2025 Hague summit, NATO leaders adopted a far more ambitious goal. By 2035, every ally will aim to invest 5% of its GDP towards defense and security. Now, before you imagine that this entire amount will be spent on tanks and fighter aircrafts, that's not how modern warfare works anymore. Out of this 5% commitment, at least 3.5% will go towards core military capabilities, armed forces, weapon systems, ammunitions, and the capability targets agreed within the NATO. The remaining up to 1.5% will support broader security investments, protecting the critical infrastructure, strengthening the cyber security architecture, improving the civil preparedness, encouraging innovation, developing artificial intelligence, and expanding the defense industrial base. This tells us something profound. The definition of defense itself has changed. Today, a country's security depends not only on the strength of its army, but also on the resilience of its power grids, its satellites, its computer networks, its ports, its semiconductor supply chains, and even its ability to produce advanced technologies at home. The numbers tell the same story. According to NATO, European allies and Canada increased their defense expenditure by nearly 20% in 2025 compared to the previous year. Together, they now spent well over $570 billion on defense. Just over a decade ago, their combined defense spending stood at about 1.4% of GDP. By 2025, it had risen to approximately 2.3%. Few statistics better capture how dramatically Europe's security thinking has changed, but differences remain. Some member states still struggle to meet even the earlier 2% target. Others are investing far more. This uneven pace continues to generate political debate within the alliance itself. Interestingly, even the United States presents a paradox. Washington has strongly encouraged its allies to move towards the 5% target. Yet, the United States itself is not expected to spend 5% of its GDP on defense. But the question is why? Because percentages tell only a part of the story. The American economy is vastly larger than any other NATO member. Even at around 3 to 4% of GDP, the United States spends far more in absolute terms than any other ally. This reminds us that burden sharing is not merely about percentages. It is also about economic capacity, industrial strength, and strategic responsibility. But military spending is only one part of NATO's transformation. When NATO was created in 1949, its greatest fear was a Soviet tank crossing the Fulda Gap. Today's threats look completely different. A cyber attack can cripple an entire banking system. Artificial intelligence is changing the nature of warfare. Satellites can be targeted without firing a shot. Critical undersea internet cables have become strategic assets. Disinformation campaigns can influence the elections. Even pandemics have demonstrated how resilience has become part of national security. Recognizing this particular changing reality, NATO's strategic concept of 2022 identified China as presenting systemic challenges to the alliance's interests, security, and values. Notice the wording carefully. China is not described as an enemy, but it is recognized as a long-term strategic challenge. This is a significant shift in NATO's perspective. For decades, NATO looked almost exclusively towards Europe. Today, its strategic thinking increasingly extends towards the Indo-Pacific, emerging technologies, cyberspace, space security, critical minerals, and global supply chains. The alliance created to deter the Soviet tanks is now preparing for an era of algorithms, artificial intelligence, and strategic competition. Which brings us to one final question. If NATO is changing so rapidly, what will this alliance look like 20 years from now? Let's find out. Let's return to the question with which we began. Will NATO survive? Perhaps. We have been asking the wrong question. The real question is not whether NATO will survive. The real question is, can NATO continue adapting to a world that is changing faster than ever before? History gives us an interesting answer. Think about it. NATO has already reinvented itself several times. It was created in 1949 to deter the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, many believed it would become irrelevant. Instead, it expanded eastwards. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Article 5 was invoked for the first and so far only time in NATO's history. The alliance shifted its focus from conventional warfare to counter-terrorism. Then came the Russia-Ukraine war. Once again, NATO transformed. Today, it is preparing for cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, space security, critical infrastructure protection, and strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. This ability to evolve explains why NATO has survived for more than 75 years. But adaptation alone will not guarantee its future. There are still difficult questions ahead. Will the United States continue to see Europe as its primary strategic priority? Or will its attention increasingly shift towards the Indo-Pacific and China's aggressive rise? Can European countries shoulder a greater share of their own security? Will political changes within the member states affect the alliance's unity? These are questions that no treaty can answer. They will be answered only by political leadership and strategic choices. A recent example perfectly illustrates how security is itself changing. Take Greenland. For decades, most people saw Greenland nothing more than a vast island covered with ice. Today, it has become one of the world's most strategically important regions. Why? Because climate change is opening new Arctic sea routes. The Arctic is believed to contain enormous reserves of rare earth minerals, oil, and natural gas. Its location is crucial for missile defense, naval movement, and great power competition. This explains why Greenland has attracted renewed strategic attention in the recent years. The lesson is very simple. The geopolitics of the 21st century is no longer confined to traditional battlefields. It now extends to Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, outer space, cyberspace, semiconductors, and the supply chains. Also the critical minerals and emerging technologies. And this brings us to India. India has never been a member of NATO, nor has it shown any intention of joining a military alliance. Since independence, India has consistently followed the principle of strategic autonomy. That is, making foreign policy decisions based on national interests rather than alliance obligation. This approach has become even more relevant in today's multipolar world. India enjoys a strong strategic partnership with the US. It conducts regular military exercises with France, with the United Kingdom, and several other NATO members. At the same time, India continues to maintain long-standing defense and energy partnerships with Russia. Rather than choosing one particular camp, India has chosen to engage with multiple partners. As former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon has argued, India's objective is not to maximize alliances, it is to maximize strategic options. And perhaps that is one of the defining features of the 21st century diplomacy. For every UPSC aspirant watching this, NATO is much more than an organization. It is one of the best case studies for understanding international relations. It helps us to understand the concepts like collective defense, balance of power, deterrence, alliance politics, strategic autonomy, the security dilemma, burden sharing, and increasingly the geopolitics of technology. So, will NATO survive? My answer is yes, but not because it is too powerful to fail. It will survive because it has repeatedly demonstrated something even more important than military strength. That is the ability to adapt. The NATO of 2045 will almost certainly look very different from the NATO of 1949. Its strength will not be measured only by the number of tanks it possesses. It will increasingly be measured by the resilience of its cyber networks, its technological innovation, its defense industries, its space capabilities, its artificial intelligence, and its ability to protect the critical infrastructure. In fact, NATO's latest defense commitments reflect exactly this transformation. The alliance now recognizes that security is no longer just about armies. It is also about innovation, industrial capacity, digital resilience, and the ability of democratic societies to withstand emerging threats. Because in the 21st century, a nation can be attacked without a single soldier crossing the border. Finally, I would like to leave you with a thought. History tells us alliances rarely collapse because of their enemies. More often, they weaken when their own members stop believing in a common purpose. Whether NATO survives the next 50 years will therefore depend not only on Russia or China or military spending. It will depend on a much deeper question. Do its members still believe that they are stronger together than they are apart? That more than anything else will determine NATO's future. Thank you for watching. If you found this discussion useful, do share it with your friends and your fellow UPSC aspirants. I am Aditya Vashist. This is Bharat and Beyond. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep looking beyond the headlines. Jai Hind. Thank you.